Welcome to the Neutral Podcast, where we discuss paving the way to a sustainable tomorrow. I'm Nate Helbach, your host, founder, and CEO of the Neutral Project, a sustainable real estate development company. Join us each week as we host world-renowned guests and explore dynamic landscapes of real estate development, alternative investing, sustainability, forestry, urbanism, and new cutting-edge carbon-neutral construction materials that are shaping the cities of tomorrow. Welcome back to the Neutral Podcast. Today I'm joined by Chris Timmins, and we're going to talk about affordable and sustainable housing economics. But just to give you a little bit of introduction before we get started into Chris's background and CV. Chris is a professor at UW-Madison Real Estate School and Urban Land Economics. He specializes in urban and environmental economics, but he also has an interest in industrial organization development and public and regional economics. He works on developing new methods for non-market valuation of local public goods and amenities, focusing on hedonic techniques and models of residential sorting. His recent research has focused on measuring the costs associated with exposure to poor air quality, the benefits associated with remediating brownfields and toxic waste under the Superfund program, the valuation of non-marginal changes in disamenitizing, and the causes of and consequences of environmental injustice. Welcome, Chris, to the show.
Nate, thanks for having me.
Of course. Chris, if you could just give us a little bit of background into what got you interested in affordable and sustainable housing and where you started.
Yeah. So going way back, I guess I actually started out more doing environmental economics by itself. I guess I kind of got interested in it as an undergrad at Georgetown. I was there doing the School of Foreign Service degree, but realized after about a year that I really liked economics, which I'd never taken before. The difference between high school and college economics is very different. So a lot of people realized when they get to college that this was something that maybe they wanted to do they never thought about. At Georgetown, I struggled to get all my math and economics sort of requirements for grad school in while doing the School of Foreign Service degree, but managed to get them in. Took no English classes in 4 years at Georgetown because I was taking nothing but math classes with every elective I had. So take that liberal education, I guess. But then went to Stanford for grad school and did economics there for 5 years. And so that was the mid-90s. And there I kind of fell into environmental economics, I guess partly because I just liked outdoorsy things, which seems kind of like trivial at this point, but the people I meet who do environmental economics, out of the pool of all the economists out there, they're definitely the ones that talk about like going hiking on the weekend. I think they actually really do like the environment. So I started off doing that, and that was sort of my job market paper, my thesis, everything surrounding that. I came out onto the academic market and was told at that time, interestingly in 1997, when you're applying for jobs, don't tell people you're an environmental economist because environmental economics is not a field. That was in 1997 to give you a sense of kind of where we've come. So I started off with this sort of dual background in environment, public economics, and industrial organization, and they all kind of tie together and they're useful, but I was kind of needed to sugarcoat my CV to get a job. But the first job then was at Yale, where I was for 7 years as an assistant professor. Super stressful time of life as an assistant professor, trying to get tenure. My wife and I had triplets during that time, so I spent a lot of the time while I was trying to get tenure not sleeping. So an offer at that point came along from Duke, which sometimes happens when you're in that sort of trying to get tenure process. And I took that move. That was a move with tenure. So life all of a sudden got much more relaxed. That was 2004. And then I was there until a year ago when I moved up to Madison. So long stretch of time in Durham, North Carolina, which is great. And that's kind of where I really developed, I think, more into an urban and environmental economist. And the what I work on today kind of gelled there.
Wow, that's awesome. What happened with the triplets? Are they out of the house now?
They're out and come back now and then. I think it's more of a fluid kind of leaving the nest thing now, where sometimes you're back for a little while and here and there. The work world, I guess, is tricky now, starting off, and but they're all basically done and out and doing something, and we see them here and there. And Madison's a nice place for them to come and visit.
Nice. I can't imagine. My wife and I had a little one about 2 years ago, and he's 22 months now, so a little less than 2 years, but it's it's been a journey, but I can't imagine 3 times that and the sleepless nights to go with it. It's probably crazy.
Yeah, there are some numbers issues there, and people would talk about economies of scale, and you can change 3 diapers at once, and that actually makes life a little bit easier because there's a lot of repetition. But those economies don't translate over to the middle of the night when one wakes up and then the other 2 wake up, and your kid's back to sleep. That's when it breaks down. So
yeah, it's like the inverse of economies of scale, whatever that is.
Yeah. So I once thought about writing a little book about the economics of triplets, and I had written down a great set of notes. And then we moved from New Haven to Durham, and they all got lost in the move. And I always regret not remembering or taking better care of that, because I thought I had like a good, quick little funny book to write about. Probably economists would have been the only people who found it funny, though. So I don't know. A lot of inside jokes.
Yeah, I think that would have been a funny one. Well, getting into our first segment, just about housing economics, for the listeners that maybe didn't study economics in school or weren't listening in class, could you just give us a brief kind of teaser into micro and macro housing economics for both affordable and market rate housing?
Yeah, so I think the affordable versus market rate difference is probably not that salient. I mean, there are some differences, but I think the big difference is between micro and macro. Macro is really the study of sort of market level indicators. So the interest rate would be a big one, right? You could talk about price indices for markets and how they move around, things like that. But I do more, my work is all from the micro side. So we deal with data sets with millions of observations in them, where we see all the housing transactions that took place in the U.S. over a 20-year period. We follow individuals as they move around from house to house, and we model their decisions about where to live, the trade-offs that they make, the constraints that they face. A lot of my work recently has actually been on the constraints imposed by discrimination, in particular in the rental market. And that actually, I've been shocked in that research by just how prevalent discrimination still is. And this is, in the last couple of years. But to do that, you need to model individual decisions about why somebody would choose to live where they do. And then you can start to ask questions about the constraints they face and see how big those are. That's pretty different from, what's pushing the interest rate up or down, and how's that going to affect some other macro indicator that's going to move along with it. So I took macro. I actually, in grad school, you have to take macro, micro, econometrics, and Stanford had a class on dynamic programming too. I actually got my highest grade on the first year qualifier exams on the macro test, and then never did anything with macro after that.
Nice. That's awesome.
Not really my thing. But the micro side of it is, I think, full of lots of interesting things. And yeah, we'll talk more about some of those as we go through it, I guess.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, on the micro side of things, with why do people live where they do, what was kind of the result that you found in your research?
Oh, well, I mean, we've been studying that now for 25 years in a lot of different contexts. So some of it is about trade-offs, pollution versus price and things like that. That was kind of the older stuff that I would study. And you mentioned hedonics in the introduction. That's a term that I think a lot of people here are kind of wonder what that is. That's really just asking the question about how do house prices, how do rents reflect the underlying characteristics of the neighborhood. And from that, you can value people's preferences for those characteristics. So I can tell you how much people, in dollar terms, how much they value a unit reduction in particulate matter outside their front door based on the trade-offs they make between a more less expensive house and all sorts of other things that they have to give up in order to get that more expensive house, or things that they're getting in exchange for paying more. So that's kind of what most of the work that I do centers around that. I teach, starting in another 2 weeks, I'm teaching a PhD level class here that's basically about that. So that's kind of, those kinds of trade-offs are all over the place. More recently, we've gotten into how do constraints bind those trade-offs. So what you may end up seeing is people in a certain disadvantaged group might look like they don't care about pollution because we see them moving into polluted neighborhoods even without getting a strong price discount. So I think the way we used to do hedonic analysis in economics would say, well, there's I don't want to get too wonky here. There's different preferences amongst different groups, and maybe we shouldn't worry that much about dumping pollution in neighborhoods of color because it looks like those people don't care about, that is a problem. But when you go and you actually focus on it, they may very well be interested in less polluted neighborhoods, but when they go try to buy a house or when they go try to rent an apartment in the less polluted neighborhood, they're turned away by a real estate agent or by a landlord. And we find really strong evidence of that, which is the thing that I find probably the most shocking. A lot of people, I think, would like to think that we're in somewhat of a post-racial world at this point, or that racism has declined. And, maybe it has to some extent, but not nearly as much as it needs to.
Yeah, we're going to talk about this in a segment in the future, but it's all about kind of environmental justice and looking at the hedonics of air pollution. And one of the things that I was noticing is that there's not that much data on water pollution, but I'm sure, I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but I'm sure it's probably equal to or even greater than, as far as the effects on the people living in those areas, the water pollution of the environment. And so from the hedonics perspective, like how do you basically understand the different areas, like, for example, air pollution, water pollution? Another thing we're going to talk about later in the episode is urban trees, which is very exciting because we love trees. But like, how are you calculating, and what is the mathematical equations that go into, like, what makes an area maybe more appealing or less appealing for people to live in?
Yeah, it's a lot about collecting really good data, right? So we have to go out, and I always say that the things people care about first and foremost, especially if you've got kids, it's usually something about schools and education. Then there's usually something about crime and public safety. Then you have restaurants, and you've got access to arts, and you've got you can list off a dozen other things, one of which is going to be how good the air smells when you go outside your front door, right? And does it seem smoggy, or does it seem, and sometimes the things we're trying to model people don't know are there, which makes it even trickier, right? Then we have to use different strategies. And sometimes the water is the problem, right? And then do people actually know if there's PFAS in their water or if there's other problems? A lot of people don't know. They don't have testing. So you have to get really good data on all those things, because if you don't control for instance, public safety, and then you try to model air quality, if public safety and air quality go together, or bad air quality and bad public safety go together, then you can misinterpret the bad public safety as being an air quality effect, right? And you can end up with that correlation showing up in your data. So to get something that's a really good measure that you can take to policymakers, you have to control for all of those different things. And that's usually the problem. So we have a lot of grad students here at the university who work on data sets for us, a lot of GIS work, taking data about pollution of various kinds and mapping it and putting it onto data about housing so that we can get a really clear picture of what it's like to live at every house in a data set with millions of houses.
Yeah, and that's got to be challenging, especially like if you look at disadvantaged or lower income neighborhoods, there could be miscorrelation, right, between the air pollution and, like you said, maybe crime, and maybe someone's not living there because of the crime and not necessarily because of the air pollution, but the air pollution is still there.
Exactly. And you got to account for everything that's going to drive their decision if you want to back out the effect on that one particular thing you're interested in. You mentioned an interesting point, though, the air pollution in low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color. Very often what we find is that we don't measure the air pollution very well in those places. So we tend to, as a society, we've tended to avoid monitoring pollution in low-income and neighborhoods of color, partly because we don't want to have to clean it up. I mean, I'm ascribing some intention, maybe where I shouldn't, but there's pretty strong evidence that we sometimes avoid putting monitors in places where we think the pollution is bad, because if we know it's bad now, all of a sudden the EPA tells us we have to clean it up. Where we do put the pollution monitors is often where the most politically powerful people are, right? Because they want to know if it's dirty so that they'll get it cleaned up. And we leave the monitors out of the places where the more disadvantaged, politically less powerful groups are. This is a key problem in environmental justice. How we monitor pollution and how we actually collect data is not equal.
Yeah. We'll circle back on that point in a future segment down here. But let's talk a little bit about sustainable real estate. And I think you have a beautiful definition of sustainable real estate. So maybe you could give that to us.
So I would start by pulling back and giving you the economist's definition of sustainability before we even get into the real estate part. And I try to do this with my classes when I've taught at both Duke and now at the UW, on environmental economics and then on sustainable real estate development. But essentially, sustainability, I think, gets a lot of sort of there's a lot of labels for what sustainability is, and I think often those labels, be it a sustainable real estate certification or something like that, those are all clearly things that help with sustainability, but they're not the core element of what sustainability is. So for sustainability, I go back to the work of Robert Solow, who was an economist who wrote a lot of papers back in the 1980s and probably into the 1990s. Not exactly sure when he retired, but his basic notion was this idea that we live in a world where we're going to run out of things, and sustainability requires us to keep the level of happiness that we're experiencing today as a society the same for future generations. So the future generation should be able to be just as happy as we are, simplest way to put it. That only works if they have the tools at their disposal to generate happiness, right? So there are some things that if we use them up today, they're not going to have them available tomorrow in order to generate happiness. Now, that's a problem if you have things that are indispensable, right? So we can't really find a substitute for clean air. That's something that we need today and they're going to need tomorrow. There's no way around that. Clean water, natural environment, lots of things. There are other things that we can use up today and replace with things that we can generate through our innovative processes, right? Human capital is thinking of great new ways to do things. So a lot of minerals that we might run out of, we might say, fine, because we can substitute with technology for what that mineral was doing for us. Fossil fuels would be an example of that, although using up the fossil fuels has its own set of problems associated with it, right? So that we kind of push off to the side and think about separately, but copper, aluminum, things like that, we can find other minerals and we can come up with synthetics that can do a lot of these same jobs. So for those things, we need to replace them. And then for things we can't replace, we need to save them. And we need to draw lines around things that have no substitutes and be sure we don't run out of them. And sometimes we need to slow down the rate at which we're using them so that we delay the process of running out of them until we can think of a substitute. So a lot of what we do in sustainability studies is, think about what are the things that have no substitutes, have to be preserved, and what's the most cost-effective way to preserve them, right? And then that can get around to things like certification programs that basically, make it so that we don't have to burn as much fossil fuel. We can preserve a livable ecosystem, one that's not getting too hot or too wet or too dry, and lots of other, things where we're going to slow down our use, say, of fresh water, right, and storm runoff and things like that. I see that often in certification designs. So the things we often label as sustainability come back to that core definition, I think, but you have to draw a line to get there.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because a lot of the times on our podcast, we have people on that talk about certifications or very specific ideas and things we're doing and implementing in industry to be able to combat climate change and initiate sustainability. But it's interesting to kind of zoom out and say, really, why should we care? And I think that's something that obviously you focus a lot on. But just kind of out of curiosity, why should the general public, if you're just kind of a random guy on the street or a random lady on the street, looking at sustainability and this idea of like sustainability from an economics perspective, why should they care? Like, what is their value proposition?
So that's kind of interesting, right? Because at some level, sustainability is all about future generations. There's really two ideas, though, that we can bring in. One is that the basic idea I laid out a few seconds ago is future generations should be as happy as we are today. So if you don't care about the future generations, all of a sudden your investment in sustainability might go down and you may not care. It does bring in an ethical perspective, should you care, right? The other feature, though, is that for the future generation to be as happy as we are today, it's easier for them to be happy if all of the resources devoted to making people happy are not clustered in one small group. So inequality is bad for sustainability. It's easier to make everybody happy today and tomorrow if we spread the resources out. So fighting inequality, fighting discrimination, lots of this, the UN sustainable development goals, a lot of them are actually just about reducing inequality today, which will hopefully lead to reduced inequality tomorrow. That actually is a sustainable concept as well. So if you don't care about people in the future, but you care about the people elsewhere in the world today, you are also caring about sustainability. I think there's kind of two paths you can take to that. If you don't care about anybody elsewhere in the world and you don't care about the future generations, then you probably have a pretty solid reason to say sustainability is not important to you. So I don't have an answer for that person.
I would take an argument for those people that maybe are in that camp, which hopefully there's not a lot of those people listening, but there might be one or two. Is there anything from like more of the environmental side of things, like the natural? One of the things I talked about on our another previous podcast with Troy Harris from Jamestown was this idea of natural capital and really looking at sustainability through the lens of how much resources do we actually have, and let's quantify that in a economics perspective of basically monetary capital, and then how do we use that in a judicious manner. And so if you don't care about tomorrow, if you don't care about other people, is there any idea of like, hey, I care about these natural resources that we have, and like you said, we need to draw lines around those natural resources, the things that are limited. Is there an argument there for those people that maybe don't care about the other things?
Well, I mean, even there, the reason you would care about natural capital and not using it all up today, for instance, is because you think we need some of it around tomorrow. So that's kind of the same argument. I think the reason that if you have no interest in future generations and you're not concerned about inequality, you may care about sustainability because it helps us to actually develop technologies that improve our lives today, right? So carbon is actually one of the things where, 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, we probably were still thinking, coming up with technologies to adapt to climate change are going to benefit our grandchildren in 80 years, right? Now I think we're starting to see that developing technologies to adapt, mitigation aside, but developing technologies to adapt have benefits today. Like we're experiencing events that I think we can attribute to climate change. And even if you're skeptic on that, knowing how to deal with flooding and knowing how to deal with extreme heat is important today. So coming up with those tools, I think has, if you're living in Phoenix today, you benefit from sustainability studies, whether you care about future generations or not, because we're coming up with ways to more effectively cool down residential living, right? And making it feasible to live in a place where it's 120 degrees. And what they should, maybe that's a whole separate question, but yeah, that might be a useful thing for us. But the cost accounting, the green accounting, I think is kind of what you were getting at a few minutes ago. that really is speaking towards the future again. And there's this whole sort of macro world in sustainability, macroeconomics, where they come up with ways to sort of, if you're a country and you're using up your natural resources in order to grow and to get a big GDP, we should actually bump your GDP down to reflect the fact that you burned up a lot of that natural capital to get that GDP growth. And they go through and they create shadow accounting tables for the whole world to show how much GDP growth would be if you took into account the environment and the natural resources that you used up to get that GDP growth, right? So it encourages you to do things that don't burn up as much natural capital in the process of having lots of jobs and building lots of houses and making things. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so in summary, as we move on here, just so we have this as kind of a fixation almost for the episode, is your definition of sustainability is there's finite resources and not finite resources. And the finite resources, we need to draw lines around and say, okay, these are off limits almost, or at least we can use them slowly in a judicious manner. And the infinite resources that we have that will be almost regenerative, right? Those things we can use likewise as judicious, but we should be using them almost more readily. Like trees are a good example of that, I think, because trees continue to grow and hopefully will continue to grow for decades to come. But is that, in summary, kind of what your definition of sustainability is?
Yeah, I think that would be the sort of economics, high-level definition that we would think about. There are other definitions out there that kind of work off of that. So a listener might be more familiar with sort of there's a definition that sort of says we really can't know how much at risk we are of running out of something. So we should just create some sort of rules of thumb, right? And you always want to use up renewable things at a rate that's below the rate at which they're renewing, leaving yourself a little bit of wiggle room. So we never want to fish a fishery up to the point where we think we're putting it at risk of collapsing. We want to stay back from that level, right? We never want to cut down the trees so fast that all of a sudden we might find that the forestry that we were counting on all of a sudden has collapsed. And that's sort of a, more of a rule of thumb way to approach it. It's not based on a lot of hard math, but I think that there's some value to that because often our math is wrong. We don't always know exactly how many fish we can take out of the ocean before the fishery collapses. So maybe we should be careful and hang back a little bit.
And in practicality, how do you see these principles applying to real estate? Like we talked about certifications before, and certifications are great, but maybe just taking a step back from certifications and just looking at like decision-making and the paradox of decision-making in real estate. How should we as developers be thinking about real estate decisions in the context of the sustainability definition?
Yeah, I mean, so I think one of the bigger, I hear this a lot from developers, is that the horizon over which they're making decisions might not be long enough to justify certain things, right? So having a 30-year horizon, which you can actually start to get that, I think, more in the affordable sector that I've spent a lot of time working in and talking to developers in, where they have to sort of have this unit be affordable for decades, and a lot of them own the unit for that time period and rent it out themselves. They can afford to do things that are more costly today, even if it's going to lead, if it's going to take 30 years before that thing pays off. And I think that would be great if that sort of principle could work its way out into the broader world of real estate, and we could end up with, a longer time horizon where a smaller discount rate is that would sort of be the economics way of thinking about it. So I think that's important. And then I think we can get into a lot of specifics. So certifications are big, they're important, but also just the way we construct cities. I think a lot of thought now is going into, a lot of the ways we lay out cities in the U.S. are really not very good for preserving resources, and denser development, infill development, kind of not having people driving 45 minutes so that they can live on a plot of land that's bigger than they need anyway. These are sort of principles that all filter back down to that sustainability definition we were just talking about.
And going back to the developer idea of looking at longer time horizons, And when you say most developers are looking at maybe short-time horizons, you're inferring that basically the developer is saying, well, I'm going to build this building and hold it for 5 years and sell. So why would I care what happens to the building in 50 years from now? And so with that idea, like, do you think that's somewhat myopic of an idea of a developer to say, well, I shouldn't care what happens to a building 50 years. I should just care what happens in 5 years?
Well, it may be myopic, but I mean, the thing I guess in economics is that we expect people to respond to the incentives that they're given. And if you have no incentive to think beyond 5 years, then I don't have any reason for you to do so. This is where the public sector kicks in. And I'm a big believer in, rules being set up to sort of deal with market failures. And we might view this as a way that the market is failing if a developer has no reason to think beyond 5 years. So maybe we need to think about things we could do policy-wise that would make them care, right? I mean, there may be ways that you could incentivize some of those future gains that would happen from building a more energy efficient building to get priced into the current price at which the builder might sell it for in 5 years, right? And that's, I think, what some of these certifications can help with. If there's a premium for a LEED certified building, or I say LEED now, but I'm sure there's something that would be sexier that you could get your building labeled with. And if you get a premium for that, then you may be more than happy to put in those extra, bells and whistles that will make the place be more energy efficient for the next 50 years. But if we don't have that, if there is no incentive, I don't have a reason why builders should care.
And you don't think builders should care from this idea of like economic scarcity, where resources are scarce? In the future, we probably won't be able to build with the same resources we're building with today if we continue on this very slippery slope, I would say. And so if you look at this idea of like scarcity to abundance in economics, and you say that, okay, well, concrete and steel, if we continue doing what we're doing, are scarce and won't be available in 50 years or 25 years. And looking more at that time frame of like, okay, well, if my business is dependent on building buildings and I want to be in it for the next 25 to 50 years, and I won't be able to build with the same materials that I'm building with today, you don't think that's a big enough motivation for them to say, okay, I'm going to change my methodologies?
I mean, I get that idea, right? That if you're in it for the long haul, in the sense, not for a particular building you're going to own, but I want to keep building I want to give this business to my kids and I want to let them build, right? Then you can see where that kicks in and where that would matter. The problem is that you as a single individual have a hard time affecting sort of the prices and affecting the way in which, you could make that change and you're going to cost yourself money. And other builders might take advantage of that because now all of a sudden it's easier for them to get concrete today because you're not using it, right? You really need everybody to get on board together. And this is where government can actually do something, right? They could do it with a stick or a carrot. The carrot would be creating a certification that makes it attractive and where you can make some extra money by doing it and not using concrete today, for instance. The stick would be to say, we're going to put a tax on concrete, or we're going to make it so that it's more expensive now to build with these things that we're going to run out of. Both of those would achieve the goal. It's usually easier politically to get carrots than sticks passed.
And what carrot would you recommend that we do relatively immediately to help cure some of these kind of reprehensible damages that we've caused?
I think we do have a lot of subsidies for, energy efficient building. And if we think about, the thing we're going to run out of is being climate we can live in, right? Which is putting the sustainability stamp on carbon and on climate. You have to think in terms of, I need an environment I can walk outside in and not bake to death. And, I need a livable environment. We do have a lot of subsidies today for building in ways that don't use fossil fuels, right? And building, and that's essentially what you're saying. So those subsidies make a lot of sense. And it could be subsidies for solar, it could be subsidies for wind, it could be subsidies for more energy efficient appliances, it could be doing things to weatherize houses, it could be subsidies. I think WIDA here in in Wisconsin, and I know in a lot of other states, you can get benefits in building an affordable unit. If you do passive house, right, you do things where you can heat and cool the unit that don't actively use energy, right? So there's a lot of examples out there, I think, of policies that would basically, fix that market failure.
Yeah. And what do you think is the, just looking broadly again and zooming back out just to sustainability, where do you think we should be putting our investments? Is it sustainable real estate, energy, transportation, carbon capture? What do you think is the low-hanging fruit for us to focus on immediately?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say carbon capture is one that I'm starting to get more skeptical on. I've read a lot.
Thank you.
Are you in agreement?
Same. Yes.
I've read more and more now, too, about how carbon capture actually can lead to bad environmental justice problems because there are things that get emitted in the carbon capture and storage process that are bad local pollutants. So it's great to take carbon out of the atmosphere, but you actually release things that cause health problems for the people who live nearby. And some research that I've read recently suggests that those health problems are disproportionately falling on low-income neighborhoods of color and because of where these plants get built. Anyway, that's a diversion on carbon capture.
I just to continue down that route for a second, how I equated it, because we were just talking about this yesterday, is there's these new shots that you can get if you're overweight and you want to lose weight. Instead of going to the gym and working out and eating maybe a healthier diet, less soda, less alcohol, you just get a shot, and the shot will make you lose weight. But there's a lot of side effects to the shot in your body. And so people are getting these shots without realizing the side effects. And I think carbon capture is the same thing. It's we have a existential issue here that's going on that we need to figure out how to change our methodology and way of living to address it, and not just take a shot to be able to basically remove the problem. So we could stay on that for a long time, but I'll digress.
I'm guessing you're probably also not a fan of geoengineering and putting things into clouds to reflect light back into the
No, not at all.
Me either. So yeah. No, I think if I were going to devote more energy in one particular direction, it would be to cleaning up the grid, and getting a grid that can be cleaner is sort of the premise, I think, for electric vehicles actually, giving us the benefits we want them to give us, right? It's the same thing for switching over from, burning fossil fuels in your house to electrifying your cook stove and having a heat pump. That's all great. The electricity that's coming in is being produced cleanly. I was a little disappointed when I started to look. I think here in Wisconsin, our electricity isn't so clean. So, I think we definitely have some room to grow there. I think that's true in a lot of states. So I would definitely do that. That's not a simple thing, though, where the sun only shines during the day and the wind stops blowing now and then. So we need batteries. We need ways to store energy to electrify the grid. There's a lot to be done there. And I think that's where I would devote most of my energy if I had to pick one thing. Yeah,
no, it's becoming more and more apparent to me as well, because we've been looking at our energy usage for the buildings. And we were talking about this earlier, but with right now, some of our energy is coming from gas, which there's an argument to be made that in Wisconsin, gas is actually cleaner than our electricity, because a lot of the energy manufacturers like MG&E, even though they have great marketing, and I would almost contend it's somewhat greenwashing, is mostly coming from coal. And so it's until we figure out a way to clean the grid, gas is actually somewhat a little bit better. And I know it's kind of poo-poo to say that, but it's this is the facts. These are the truths.
The bridge fuel argument is definitely one that I've argued with people about a lot, and I can see both sides, but you can get stuck on gas if you don't. Sometimes it could be an excuse to not develop the rest of the grid the way we should, but gas is clearly going to be better, for instance, in the short run than sticking there with coal-based electricity. So using the gas now, but being really conscientious about getting us to a place where we don't need it anymore. I think that's what the politicians should be focused on.
So we should really be lobbying nuclear. our next business is neutral nuclear. So I'll let you know when we start it.
Okay. It's an endeavor there.
Yeah, that's a big one. Okay, well, moving on to the next segment, you wrote this great piece called "Cool Cities: The Value of Urban Trees," which, of course, I'm picking that piece because I love trees. And so I wanted to dive into just the topic of urban trees, especially in downtown environments. And so, what do you see as the biggest kind of environmental effect of planting trees in urban areas?
Yeah. So first, I'll call out my co-authors on this. Lou Hahn, who's here at the University of Wisconsin with me, Stefan Kieblich, who's at the University of Toronto, and Janos Zilberberg, who's at the University of Bristol over in the UK. And we've been working on this together, I guess, for 3 or 4 years now. And I think the big benefits of trees, well, the one that we're primarily focused on in this work is dealing with the urban heat island effect. So it's really about temperature, although you can argue that there are benefits of trees that have nothing to do with climate. There's research showing that people are generally happier when they're around trees, that they are soothing, that they have lots of other benefits. But focusing on temperature, which is what we do in that paper, when the sun shines, it tends to heat up things, especially things made out of concrete. And from what I know about, passive house building and things like that, you actually can use that to your benefit, right? If you're in a cold environment, you build a big concrete block on the side of the house that heats up in the morning and it stays hot all day and helps to keep the house warm. So there's some benefit to that. But one of the big problems is you get cities where there's big blocks of concrete. Interestingly, a lot of those big blocks of concrete tend to be in places that got bulldozed in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, which tended to be places that were redlined back in the 1930s and 40s, where there was very little housing investment and the houses tended to deteriorate. This was later under the guise of slum clearance and urban renewal, the way it was labeled. But basically, then you get these warehouses, you get stadiums, you get big buildings that retain a lot of heat overnight. Even they don't cool down, and that keeps the city hotter than the outlying lands. So they've done just heatscapes of the landscape around cities, and you can show very clearly that it's just hotter downtown where there's lots of concrete. So the trees actually actively fix that. They absorb the heat. They keep it from going into the concrete. They're naturally cooling. They basically cool down. We measure in that paper the degree to which the trees drop the temperature nearby. And what you tend to find is that houses then sell for more in the places where that's happening. So I go back to the hedonics we talked about earlier. And what we try to do is disentangle sort of the energy savings or the cooling effect in terms of not having to air condition your house so much from sort of the other benefits of trees, which, the fact that they're just nice to have around. And we're one of the first papers to do that. The real trick, this gets into sort of what economists spend a lot of their time doing, is disentangling things in hedonic analyses. And the problem is that places where there's lots of trees have a lot of other nice stuff, right? So neighborhoods with lots of trees generally have lower crime. They generally have schools that might be better funded. They might have nicer restaurants, lots of other things that you need to control for if you don't want to attribute all of those things to the trees. So in that paper, we actually use a trick. Economists call this a natural experiment. So a not natural experiment, a regular experiment, would be what Pfizer does when they're testing to see if the COVID vaccine works. A natural experiment is one that just happens and you take advantage of it. So what we do is we look at the emerald ash borer, which came into Toronto and knocked out all of the ash trees. Not all of them, but most of them. It was pretty damaging to Toronto. And ash trees were interspersed kind of randomly throughout the city of Toronto. So some neighborhoods lost all their trees in the matter of a few years and other neighborhoods didn't. And what we do is we look to see how the changes in property values correspond to those changes in tree cover, right? And neighborhoods that had great schools and good public safety might have been just as likely to lose their trees as neighborhoods that didn't. So we're able to disentangle the effect of the tree from everything else about the neighborhood. So we're hoping that that's the really convincing part of that paper that sells it.
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting just purely from a real estate ownership perspective and understanding that neighborhoods that have trees are associated with higher property value. I think it's something that a lot of people would not correlate, but it is correlated.
Really, and it's not that expensive, really, in the end. What we find is that from a cost-benefit perspective, it's really worth it to grow more trees, and it's worth it to protect them. So cities should be investing in their trees.
Yeah. No, and one of the things that I wanted to show, which if you're watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see this. If you're not watching on YouTube, we'll have it in the show notes. And it's page 25 of this paper that Chris co-authored. But on the left here, it shows the normalized difference vegetation index, NDVI, of where trees are in a downtown area. And on the right side, it shows the temperature in those areas, and the red is hotter and yellow is colder. And so it's really interesting to see that on where the trees are located in this downtown area, which I think is Toronto, is colder, like significantly. And where the trees are not located, where it's more dense, it's pretty warm. And it's due to what Chris brought up, which is this urban heat island effect. But you cited in your paper, and I'll just read it. We find that a 10 percentage point additional tree cover within a postal code reduces the average temperature during summer months by about 2.7% Fahrenheit or 0.8% degrees Celsius, and lowers the average daily energy consumption by 1.5 kilowatt hours, which corresponds to a monthly savings of 7.5 CAD. And I mean, that's pretty significant for just adding elm trees into a neighborhood. I mean, it's not really that hard for a city to plant a few more trees.
No.
It adds a big effect.
Yeah. No, and we find actually when you go and you look at the prices of houses, there's an additional effect that's really quite large on top of that energy savings. The energy savings is really not even the big part of it. People just like the trees, but you can justify the trees with really just the energy savings part. The thing we never got into really there, because we couldn't get the data really well from Toronto, was the winter effect. And there is actually some benefit too in the winter from the trees. Not just they keep the place cool in the summer, but in the winter they block the wind. And this is probably more of a Toronto, Madison thing than it would be North Carolina. But with the wind block, you can actually cut down on your heating costs. So that's an additional benefit that we don't get into a whole lot in this paper. But with that, the benefit of the trees would be even greater, right? So that generally with a cost-benefit analysis, if you can show that the costs are lower than a benefit and there's other benefits you're not even measuring, then you're home free in terms of saying this is a good thing to do.
And what is an urban heat island effect, Chris, just so that for those listening that maybe haven't heard that term, they know what it is?
Yeah, I mean, it's really just think about there being a little island of concrete in the middle of a city, and it heats up during the day, sun shining on it, concrete holds heat, and overnight, normally what would happen is things cool off again and then reheat up again in the morning, but in places with lots of concrete, that heat doesn't dissipate. So you wake up the next day and it's still hot there, and basically these places don't cool off all summer, and if you live around that place, you're just exposed to that higher level of heat all the time.
And in your paper, did you guys research anything into like were people from a Hedonics perspective interested in living in areas where there was this heat island effect or where there was less of a heat island effect?
Well, I think what we find is that the prices are higher, right? And when prices are higher in places with more trees and lower temperatures, that suggests people are trying to live there. They're paying more in exchange for living in that cooler environment. So we measure the people's preferences. We measure their willingness to pay for something like cooler temperatures with the higher prices that they're paying for a house. So we do find, yeah.
Wow. Yeah, it's fascinating. We'll link the rest of the white paper if someone's interested in reading more in our show notes so you can read it and spend more time. But we will move on to our next section, which is on another paper that you wrote, Chris, which is mostly focused on environmental justice. And it's titled Recent Findings and Methodologies in Economic Research in Environmental Justice. But can you just give us like a brief overview of kind of how you view environmental justice more from like the real estate perspective?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's good actually to go back to start off with the EPA's definition of environmental justice. And that's not the only one that's out there, but I like it because what it does is it narrows down on two things. One is disproportionate exposure. So there's gaps in exposure to lots of nasty things and lots of different sources of pollution, urban heat, lots of other things that we might think we would want to be able to stay away from. And different groups are going to be disproportionately exposed. That's the first sort of key thing. The second feature of the EPA's definition is about procedural justice, which is actually something economists tend to ignore a lot. But this is, how do people actually get to participate in the process that leads to those disproportionate exposures, right? So this gets into the sort of the politics, and it gets into the capital that people have in the marketplace. So if you're unable to, participate in governance and the politicians aren't taking your needs seriously, procedural justice is a problem. So both the sort of exposure side of it and the procedure side of it are the two pieces that kind of go together. There's ample evidence out there that low-income communities and communities of color are disproportionately exposed to lots of bad things. We could go through almost any pollutant you want, and I could show you maps. I could show you correlation tables, easy to find. Then the question, though, that I'm really interested in as an economist is why? How did we get there, right? Because if you don't know why, if you don't know the process that gets you to this point, it's really hard to fix. So a couple of the stories that explain how you get to this point of disproportionate exposure. One would be simply that the pollution that we see was dumped into neighborhoods disproportionately. So this is an early sort of narrative that you saw a lot in the environmental justice literature, is that, toxic waste sites, a lot of, hazardous facilities for burning hazardous waste, things like that, are cited in low-income communities of color. And you go back and ask why, and it's because those groups had no participation in the local governance. So it's easy to put those things there. That's one answer that I think makes a lot of sense. But there's another answer that economists, I think, have a lot that they can say, and it's because we study housing markets. We study people making choices about where to live. And often what we find is that people are living in these neighborhoods because they moved in there, right? The economist then needs to be very careful about how they think about that result. Then we see a low-income person, a person of color moving into a neighborhood that's really polluted, right? Because an easy sort of lazy answer or way to evaluate that would be to say, well, they're moving in because they don't care, right? And I've seen that kind of lazy answer reported before. But there's this idea in economics that's really important, and I'll get a little bit wonky here. It's the marginal utility of income. So any of your listeners who've taken that first year micro theory class have heard that concept, but let me just, in words, what it is that an additional dollar in your wallet is worth more to you the poorer you are than the richer you are. When you get rich, having that additional dollar, what it's going to buy you in terms of happiness is lower than what it buys you in terms of happiness when you're poor, right? And it's, you just think about it, what's the thing you're going to buy when you've got no money to your name? You get a little bit of money, now you're getting necessities, right? You're living on hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and I give you another dollar. Maybe it's getting the king size instead of the medium coffee at Starbucks or something, right? It's a very small benefit to your utility, to your happiness. So that alone, that feature of the way our minds work, right, and the way that happiness works is enough to say that if you don't have much money, you're going to need to make hard trade-offs. You might choose to live in a polluted neighborhood because you need lower rent so that you can buy food to feed your family, right? So that you can buy health care so that your kids don't get sick. When you're really rich, spending extra money to live in an unpolluted neighborhood is fine, right? I mean, you've got plenty of extra cash. You don't need to worry about those necessities, so you can upgrade to a fancier house in an expensive neighborhood. So there's lots of reasons why we might end up seeing people choosing to live in these more polluted neighborhoods. And that alone can explain a lot of the disproportionate exposure. And I think that that's actually a really important reason why we see why we have environmental justice problems in the world. Why does that matter? Because if we want to fix it, we actually need to fix those trade-offs. And how we fix those trade-offs is a difficult thing. I've got very sustainable lights here that shut off if I don't move after 20 minutes. So
nice. That's awesome.
It definitely helps. But what we need to do, just to get back to that idea, is we need to actually fix income inequality if we're going to fix the dynamic that leads people to choose to live in a polluted neighborhood. That's an income inequality problem. That's a big societal problem, way bigger than just talking about where we put our polluting sites. Okay? So I like, when I teach environmental justice, I like to try to tie this in the end back to the bigger problem of income, wealth, opportunity distribution in society in general, right? That's where these problems originate.
Yeah, that's interesting. So just so I can kind of summarize that, is basically when you look at these lower income disadvantaged communities, the people that are living there aren't necessarily choosing to live in that specific area because they want to live in a polluted neighborhood with bad air quality and bad water quality, right? That doesn't sound very logical. But what they're doing is basically they have this hierarchical choice of decisions that they have to make, like you said, and they have to decide, hey, how am I going to get healthcare for my family? How am I going to put food on the table for my kids to eat? And then they basically come to a decision based on that hierarchical decision matrix. And looking at this idea of marginal utility, they're saying, well, marginally, it doesn't matter if I have better air quality because I need food for my kids. And so I'm going to live in a worse neighborhood or a neighborhood that has more pollutants because these other things in the hierarchy are more important than, hey, sustainability.
Yeah.
But then
forcing people into trade-offs that I think as a society we might not be comfortable with if we think about it.
So leading off that, how can we change the paradigm? Like how does that change from allowing people to actually make a decision of, okay, all things being equal, do you want to live in a polluting neighborhood, which logically probably most people don't, but maybe there's some outliers, or do you want to live in a neighborhood that has canopy, tree cover, and is better water, better air, etc.? Like how do you separate those two in your analysis? Because I imagine it's pretty hard to do from a data perspective.
Well, I mean, so what we do is we model people's preferences for all those good things: tree canopy, good schools, public safety, etc. You basically model their so everybody can, if everybody's income were the same, the model would suggest they would all have an equal preference for tree canopy. But then what happens is we see people with different income making different decisions, and that tells us the extent to which those trade-offs start to kick in. That identifies the marginal utility of income and how it declines as you get richer, how the extra dollar means less to you as you get richer. Because we see people with more money making different trade-offs than people with less money. But the model put all together, the coherent model all in one place, would suggest that if I took the poorer person and gave them the richer person's income, they would want the exact same neighborhood that the richer person has. Right?
And the same thing in the inverse. If you took the richer person and gave it the poorer person's income, they would be living in a polluting neighborhood.
They would then go make those same trade-offs, right? So basically, it's very egalitarian in that we model everyone as having essentially the same preferences, conditional on having the same resources to spend to get things. And then we use the differences in the resources that people have to explain why people go to different places, why they end up making different choices.
And how can government incentives maybe level the playing field so that everyone has the same choice and decision that they can make or not make?
I mean, there's really two ways to go, right? One is that you could make the actual playing field level so that wherever you choose to live, you get the same trees and lack of pollution. So coming up with a way to do things in a more environmentally sensitive way with less pollution is good, right? If we could get rid of toxic landfills and we could get rid of, plants that belch out particulate matter, that would solve the problem to some extent. That's a hard thing to do, but that would do part of it. The other solution would be to give everybody equal opportunity, right? So if everybody had the same income, then everybody would have the opportunity to go buy a house in an expensive neighborhood. And that's the alternative way to solve the problem. So there's two caveats to that, though, right? One is the solution. You could talk about things like universal basic income, right? Or you could talk about, if you don't want to go that route, you could talk about expanding job opportunities for people so that they can enhance their income that way. There are constraints, though. Even if we make everybody's opportunity set the same in terms of having the same level of income, that's when discrimination kicks in, right? And I alluded at the beginning to, I've been spending a lot of time studying discrimination, and we find a lot of evidence of it. So you can be Black in a lot of cities in the U.S. and have the exact same income as a white renter or a white home buyer and be turned away from those neighborhoods with more tree canopy or better schools. And the processes that end up turning you away are another form of market failure that we would need to address, right? So fixing income inequality, but then fixing racial inequality, fixing discrimination are both parts of this.
And it seems to me like one of the other solutions that you could discuss in the paper is fixing the underlying issue, right? So instead of having a neighborhood where they have to make the choice between good air quality in high income neighborhoods and bad air quality in low income neighborhoods, we just don't have bad air quality, right? And so I think one of the things that you cited was the Clean Air Act of 1970, that it seemed to me like it was actually a pretty good solution. I'll read what you cited in this paper because I think it's really interesting. But you said in the paper, and it was based on a study from Curie, Voos, and Walker, that 60% of the relative pollution was improved in all neighborhoods, low, medium, and high income. And so that seems like, from my perspective, that's the most ubiquitous and almost fair solution, because now people don't have to make the decision anymore. It's just like it's fixed, and now we can move on and make other decisions.
Yeah. If we could level the choice set, make it so that everybody basically can pick from a clean environment regardless of income, that's the easiest solution, right? But the Clean Air Act was remarkably effective. It reduced pollution dramatically. From a cost-benefit point of view, I think it's viewed as being, tremendously effective. But there's a lot of problems out there now that are not affected by the Clean Air Act, and pollution is still very disproportionately distributed amongst people. And fixing those problems is kind of the next level, right? We don't have a Clean Air Act yet to deal with a lot of the particulate matter problems that are still out there, with toxins, with water pollution, right? There's a lot of other problems that we still need to work on.
And if we just look at the Clean Air Act, which we'll reference as CAA, and if we look at CAA as a case study almost to say, okay, this worked, right? Because 60% relative improvement on pollution is a success. And we apply that to maybe some of these other issues like water pollution. Do you think there's a way that we actually do eventually level the playing field so that people don't have to make these choices anymore?
So the thing about the Clean Air Act was it's what we call a command and control policy. So it was very much a rule coming in saying, if you are exceeding a certain level of pollution in your environment, which is usually a collection of counties or a single county out in a rural area, we're going to come in and impose this set of restrictions on your firms, or you have to come up with a way to reduce your pollution by a certain amount. And that usually meant forcing firms to put scrubbers on smokestacks and things like that. That can actually be pretty expensive for firms to force them to basically do that. So what we've seen more of in the last 30, 40 years, I guess 30 years, is a stronger reliance on market-based mechanisms. So tradable permits, which we see, for instance, for carbon now in California and in Europe and in different places on the East Coast. They used tradable permits for sulfur dioxide in the 1990s, and it was extremely effective. Got rid of acid rain largely. The problem with those kinds of market mechanisms is they can reduce pollution a lot, but they don't always reduce it equally everywhere. Okay. So the question is, do you want to have something that could be expensive for firms, for polluting firms, like the Clean Air Act, but it has a pretty good track record of pushing down pollution? Or do you want something that maybe firms will be more accepting of, like tradable permits, might end up helping some groups more than others and could even exacerbate pollution in certain neighborhoods? That's kind of something people are studying now. But it's easier to get past because firms are happier with a tradable permit than they are with a command and control regulation. That's kind of the crux right now, which environmental economics is struggling, is how do we come up with policies like that? So, yeah, I think the Clean Air Act was really successful because it was coming in at a time when things were really bad. There was a lot of low-hanging fruit, and it did a really good job of picking that low-hanging fruit. We're probably in a trickier situation now, trickier place in terms of how we're going to make more progress. So, yeah.
And the tradable permits that you're talking about, an example of that would be like a carbon credit that we're selling. Is that right?
Yeah, this would be where you would hand out carbon credits to all the producers of carbon, say in California, and if they could reduce their carbon emissions, they could sell the credit to somebody else, right? And that would be give them a motivation to find cleaner ways to produce, because they can make money selling those credits. In the end, you're limited to the amount of carbon that's going to get produced is going to be equal to or less than the number of permits that you create, right? So at some level, it's setting a cap, and then you're allowing firms to sell the credits to whoever's going to be in the greatest need of them.
So this goes back to what we talked about before, which is the carrot and stick.
Yeah.
And that feels more like a carrot to me. And
you may still be telling them they have to lower their carbon below what they'd prefer on average for the entire state of California, but you're letting the firms that really need the carbon, like they really can't reduce their pollution, you're letting them buy it from somebody else, which is cheaper than just telling them you can't make it. So there's a carrot element to it, yeah.
I mean, I would love to digress, and maybe we can have another episode on this, because we've been talking a lot about carbon credits, because it's one thing that I get asked a lot is like, hey, with mass timber, wood sequesters carbon. If you store it, there's a carbon sink inherently. And so the idea is like, well, you should be able to sell that carbon. But right now, there's not really any publicly traded carbon market to sell it on. And in part, it's due to the government not really adopting or even caring about this idea, like we're talking about tradable permits. So I think it's a lovely idea. It's just like for the Clean Air Act specifically, I think there's other things that we have as issues that maybe we need more of a stick approach, like the CAA. For example, water pollution. Like water pollution is rampant and it's a big issue. And it's like we need to figure out a way to clean it up. So maybe something like the CAA would be applicable there, but maybe on a carbon level, we would have something more like carbon credits where it's a more carrot approach.
Yeah, I mean, you are kind of touching, though, and the EPA tried to do this a few years back, and it created a Supreme Court case type problem, right? So the EPA had an effort to regulate carbon kind of along those lines, and it got shot down. So I think I'm in agreement with you. I think we do need stricter regulation on carbon, but it's been a political problem in the past, if I'm remembering correctly here. I would throw in, though, too, you mentioned the carbon credits. There is a market out there where, there are companies that generate carbon credits by doing projects. They're often in developing countries, and then they turn around and sell those carbon credits either to companies that want them just to sort of offset their own carbon emissions. So a company, the Pope for a while there was buying carbon credits to offset his travels around the world, right? Because airline travel emits a lot of carbon. And companies create those carbon credits that you can then turn around and sell. Where you can actually generate the credits, it may not be in Wisconsin, it may be in Brazil, but it may not be as far off to being able to generate those kinds of credits out of your buildings as you might think.
Yeah, I mean, those are all those that you're talking about are called voluntary credits. And right now, because the market is, I'll say, kind of the Wild West.
Yeah.
A lot of people are growing trees in South America or Central America or Africa for very, very cheap and selling tons of carbon for little to no dollars, right? So it's relatively easy to offset. especially like now that you see it on probably when you buy an airplane ticket, you're able to buy your credits, which I'm not saying is bad. Like, that's great, but we need some sort of involuntary government mandated carbon policy that actually has what we're talking about earlier with these kind of tradable permits, where people are actually mandated to do it. Because right now, I'll say it's a little bit of it's not clear, and it's also, I don't think, really helping the actual underlying issue. It's making people feel good, I think, and say I'm reducing my carbon, but it's like you're not really helping the fundamental issues here of why we actually have an issue.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I'm more of a fan of a stick approach, and I'd like to just see a carbon tax.
Yeah. Same.
Yeah. I think a carbon tax with a very well thought out plan for what to do with the revenue. Right. So carbon tax can be very regressive. It can hit low income people very hard, but we can take that revenue, of which it would be substantial, and we could use it to do a lot of things to help the low-income communities that are going to get hit by the carbon tax, right? So the recycling of that revenue can be really important for that. So yeah, that's, in general, economists tend to like the carbon tax. It's the simplest, cleanest, most efficient way to go after the externality, to go after the costs imposed on the world by carbon most directly. But you do have to be careful with it. You have to actually not let those revenues just get sucked up and used for something else.
Yeah, I think I like actually the idea of these tradable permits better, because it continues this market force that we talk about in economics, right? It continues this, hopefully, what we see as an inefficient market become maybe a little bit more efficient as far as carbon goes, without bringing in this big like government almost. I mean, it's kind of in between this carrot and stick approach, right? It's like you're saying, hey, you have a certain amount you can't exceed, and maybe if you exceed, there's a tax, right? So there's a stick at the end. But if you don't exceed, there's no tax. But if you reduce, you can go sell the credit, just like you can go sell your affordable housing credits. And I think what that would do is it would allow developers like us and other developers that are doing things better than industry standards to say, okay, well, if I reduce by 20%, I get an extra $2 million of credits. I can use that to spend it on what it's going to cost me to reduce by 20%. But then it's like, you're not saying, just generally speaking, everyone has to get taxed, period. It's more of like, hey, if you're a bad actor and you're contributing to those bad acts, then you're getting taxed. But if you're a good actor, you're getting credits. And if you are staying in kind of the medium zone, then you just continue business as usual.
That's right. That you just made the argument for tradable permits that I use in my environmental economics class. That's like right there. You just laid it out. I will throw in the one complicating factor is co-pollutants. So the thing about tradable permit markets is they let the pollution move around, right? So if you're a good actor, you're going to reduce your pollution, and you're going to sell that pollution to a bad actor, and they're going to increase their pollution. From a carbon point of view, that doesn't matter, because as long as we have the same amount of carbon emitted, it doesn't really matter where it's coming out. It's going to float up into the atmosphere, and it perfectly distributes in the atmosphere and warms the planet according to processes, right? The problem, though, is that there are other pollutants that get emitted with carbon. And what will end up happening is a petroleum refinery might buy your carbon credits, and you're going to reduce your carbon by embodying that carbon in a building in Milwaukee or something. And then that carbon is going to get transmitted over to an oil refinery on the coast in California in a low-income neighborhood. They're going to increase their pollution beyond what it was before. From a carbon point of view, it's a wash. But from a particulate matter and from a VOCs and NOx point of view, it's way worse for the people living next to that power plant. This is the thing we have to be really careful about from an environmental justice point of view when we use these market mechanisms.
But don't you think from an environmental justice point of view, going back to your example of the petroleum factory, like at some point they're going to hit an equilibrium where it's no longer going to make sense for them to buy those credits to offset their terrible pollutants. Like at some point, they're not going to be able to sell gas for enough money to be able to actually compensate to pay for these credits and pay for their just normal course of business like they were before we enacted this policy. And that's where, if we have that, then the equilibrium in the economics for energy will become equal again once we have better energy sources, like we talked about earlier, neutral nuclear, which hopefully maybe we start in 20 years from now. But like, there's going to be other sources of energy that with this policy are now feasible because they're getting the credits from the bad actors. And so the bad actors, their price is going to increase. The good actors, their price will hopefully decrease. And as we know, supply and demand, the price will go to the good actor who prices decrease below the bad actor. So is that something that you think people factor into this analysis?
Well, I mean, what you're describing is, I think, the upside, right? In that you're going to induce good actors to do more good things, and you're going to induce firms to become good actors so they can get paid. The bad actors are only going to buy the pollution up to a point. They're not going to buy an infinite amount of it. But the fact that they're buying more of it can be a problem, and it's a distributional thing here, right? Where that pollution is going is oftentimes disproportionately in the places we worry the most about, because the petroleum plants are not built in rich, predominantly white neighborhoods. They're built in historically low-income, predominantly black neighborhoods, right? If that's where the particulate matter is going when these carbon credits start to change their locations, we're going to increase the disproportionate exposure problem. So there's a way around this, right? We can limit the number of carbon credits that flow into places where disadvantaged communities are living, right? You can just put a cap on the number of permits that a oil refinery in a low-income neighborhood of color that they can buy, and that solves a big chunk of the problem. That limits the number of carbon credits that you might be able to sell to them, right? So it might cut down on the number of transactions, but it saves us on the distributional side to some extent.
Yeah, and that segues into our last section here, just talking about like rural communities, continuing on this topic of environmental justice. But one thing we've been kind of challenged with as a large wood sourcing company is where we source our wood from. And so right now we're sourcing a lot of our CLT, almost all of it from Europe, versus sourcing local or from a United States manufacturer. Some of our wood for finished material we're sourcing from Menominee Tribal Enterprises up in northern Wisconsin, which is great because we're helping rural communities with jobs, and we're able to kind of fund our local economy. But it's on this train of thought that we're talking about with kind of carbon credits. From that perspective, are we doing something maybe that is not economically sound purely from a more economics perspective? Like, are we almost damaging ourselves in the future, looking kind of now out 25, 50 years from now, and doing something maybe non-sustainable by sourcing wood not locally? Or is it more of an economics question of, okay, well, why are you not sourcing locally? And the reason why we're not sourcing locally is because the cost of wood in Europe is over 10% less than the cost of wood in the United States. And so purely from an economics perspective, going back to supply and demand metrics, like our demand is for cost-effective wood and the supply is coming from Europe right now. So, but I wanted to get your take on like more of a longer term view, environmental justice perspective. Is that something that maybe is something we should be reconsidering or thinking about further?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the key thing here is that you should not be, as a private business person who needs to make a profit, it's not really your place to have to build up the infrastructure for that kind of timber provision, right? So you go to the place where you can get that timber cheaply, the cheapest place you can get it, which happens to be over in Europe, and you bring it back. And ideally, you would do that from a social perspective. It's the costs of bringing it back are not wiping out the benefits of the embodied carbon, and it sounds like they're not. So that's good. I will point out, I'll just throw in international large-scale shipping, ocean shipping, has a lot of other environmental problems with it. There's a researcher at Vanderbilt, Michelle Marcus, who has a really nice paper studying the health costs of ships as they pass along the coast, because they burn a really dirty form of fuel, which is kind of separate from just their carbon impact. But let's leave that on the sideline for now. The thing that you would, I think, want to do is build up the world of timber, of large-scale timber development, so that the industry grows to the point where the companies that are needed upstream from what you do start to develop, so that you can do this work, so that you can source this kind of material locally, or from at least within our continent, right? And that doesn't happen until there's enough firms doing what you're doing. So it doesn't make sense for there to be an industry to develop these kinds of logs for just you here, right? It does make sense for that industry to exist in Europe because there are more companies that are doing it. If we could get more companies here doing what you're doing, then it's going to make it feasible to locate those upstream facilities here. It's an economies of scale problem. To go back to the intro micro that we started with, in an industry with big fixed costs, you get a lower average cost when you do more of it, right? Because you can divide the costs by more units of output. So they can't afford to make logs for just you. The fixed costs are too great. But if there's 100 companies like yours, then all of a sudden now it makes sense to have that provision here, and that would cut down a lot on the costs of, the social costs, the carbon costs of getting those logs here, and make what you're doing even better. So I would suggest keep doing what you're doing. Try to induce more companies to come in. I mean, maybe competition isn't the best, but having more companies do this might actually lower your costs of sourcing in the long run if it induces entry upstream.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're open source, so we love more of our colleagues coming in and building out of wood, because it's what we need long term, going back to the long term perspective of sustainability. And it's also like we were talking about this beforehand, but if you look at northern Wisconsin's economy was, I mean, from a forestry perspective, predominantly funded by the paper industry and over the last 50 years. And so the paper industry obviously has gone down the last 10 years and pretty significantly. And so the rural communities from a social perspective up north are seeing that, the effects of that. And so I think one of the things that we could do in Wisconsin is we'll figure out a way to basically replace the income of paper with something else. And that something else, I think, could easily be mass timber and more building wood products coming from Wisconsin forestry. So something that we'll continue on the podcast to talk about. But really appreciate you coming on today, Chris, and talking about all these economic things. It's really interesting.
Thank you for having me. This has been fun.
At the Neutral Project, we're not just building structures. We're building a legacy of sustainability, helping align your investments with a sustainable future. We'd like to thank you for being part of this conversation. For more information and to stay up to date on how we're reshaping the future through environmentally conscious development, visit our social media accounts or our website at theneutralproject.com. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the Neutral Podcast.